We are, as I said, video recording, and so we do have a change of tapes every now and then, so that's why I was silent for a moment, and I was beginning to wonder whether my radio was turned on. But there's an even worse problem about leaving it than figuring out how to turn it on, which is forgetting to turn it off. And many of you remember the Naked Gun sequence with Leslie Nielsen. Well, that almost happened, so you're very lucky. We have a break now, and so if you could be back here at 10:15, we're actually going to get into the meat, so as we would say. And thank you very much, Ron, for giving us a bridge from where we are, from where Jonathan took us to possibly the future. Thank you, and see you in 15 minutes. If you could bring your coffee in here, we can begin. That would be great. So we're actually starting to get into the so-called meat of the day, and I'm reminded of an interview with a manager in a production company, a tier 1 automotive company, and the phraseology was, well, yes, ergonomic is on the plate, but it's the vegetables, not the meat. So we're going to get into the meat here today. So the plan here is that I'm going to start to introduce Z1004 and some of its main features. And in a moment, I'm going to describe how I want you to use the yellow sheets. But until I've got a couple of pages in, a couple of slides in, that's not going to work. My presentations here today are on the website. You can download them, but don't download them all at once, otherwise you'll choke both the CSA server as well as the website. So what I want to do in this hour, approximately, is to go through and introduce you to Z1004. And when Ron asked you about who had had a look at it, there was a gratifying number of people who had done that. I'm going to go through it, and if I hear shufflings of papers, I'll know that you've all read it and are very familiar with it, so I'll speed up. But given that it's a fair number of pages, I'm not sure that everyone's had the chance to read as much as perhaps you would like. So that's the summary part of it. We also have guidance and reference tools. So again, I want to introduce those and some of the ideas that went into generating them. I want to start to show some of the relationships between Z1004 and other MSD prevention approaches. And that's going to be a large part of the table work that we're going to be doing. And that completion of those comparison charts is actually the yellow sheets. And so that's going to be the raw materials, basically, that we're going to use in this afternoon to move forwards. So this morning, I'm going to give you a bit of a setup, but you're going to be doing a lot of work individually and with your group mates to fill out these yellow pages. So we know this already about the Z1000 series of standards. Z1004 is just one of many. And it's a management standard, which is a process. And so Plan, Do, Check, Act being the common name for that cycle and continual improvement process. Now, occupational health and safety management systems have been around for a while, and internationally and nationally, probably the most well-known is OHSAS, Occupational Health and Safety Assessment System, and that's perhaps the granddaddy that formed the basis of many of these. So what is it? It's a series for health and safety management system, and it's a way of organizing the elements of that management system. So I don't expect you to read the little letters, just the pop-up. So I try not to say, well, I know you can't read this, but. And I think the first point I'd like to make here is that not only do the health and safety management systems align for all of the different kinds of hazards, and we saw that in Ron's presentation about different aspects, psychological health, hearing and noise protection, workplace ergonomics. They all follow the same pattern, which means that you can use the same principles and mechanisms as other hazards. So this is taking the idea one step further up, which is that you can use the same general series of processes for environmental purposes as well as for quality. And so, again, fitting in to the way business is done is perhaps one of the ideas that I'd like to have in your brain. Okay. If you want to get your yellow sheets out, I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up. You might not actually fill them out yet, but you should certainly be thinking about filling out your yellow sheets a little later in the morning. And so what this sheet is down the side are the general elements of the occupational health and safety management system. And those would be similar elements to in all of these management systems, be they environmental, quality, or the other health and safety management systems. So these are the common bits that make those up. And as Ron indicated, they're called slightly different things in different standards, but these are the generic bits. And what I'm going to ask you to think about is this in the Z1004? And the hint is probably. The current approach that Jonathan introduced also has most of these in. But which ones and where would it be? And what kind of level of detail would we be talking about? And while we're at it, we could talk about your own organization in terms of an MSD prevention strategy. So if you're an organization that is involved in training, so how well are these elements related in the training? If you're, and whatever your organization is, do these elements exist? Because as we heard, musculoskeletal disorders are common across all sectors and types of workplaces. And what I'm going to ask you to think about is whether that activity or element is mentioned at all. So that's a 0. It's mentioned a little bit, a fair amount, or it's well covered. And so you'll see that there's those little tiny thin columns, and that's where I'm going to ask you to put those pluses and pluses there. So they're easy to find. And then in the block that's next to it, to write down the section number or where you found it or anything, or I couldn't find this anywhere or whatever. And we're going to be using these as we move ahead. And I'll be introducing Janet Brown, who's our facilitator, Janet, who's going to be leading us through using this information. So have that in mind as we step through it. You don't have to do it now. We're going to have time a bit later on when I've introduced this issue. But that's the goal of this morning, and perhaps a little bit this afternoon, is to have our raw material. What's in, what's out? Is it well covered? Is it missing? And that will help us in our afternoon discussions about, you know, are these exactly the same? What about some other approaches? What's your organization doing? And I hope that will be both interesting and might provoke some useful discussion as we move ahead in the afternoon. So we'll be talking a lot about yellow sheets. Everyone should have one. If you don't, or you mess it up, or you want another one, we do have extra copies. The green page is a bit more explanation about what each of these terms means. And so that's your reference sheet. And I think this is the time that I should just introduce Amin Yazdani, who's standing at the back. And Amin is a PhD student with me whose interest is in occupational health and safety management systems. So if I get it wrong, it's not Amin's fault, it's my fault. So I'm sure he's going to be making signs at me from the back. So we have these two pieces of paper. And as we move through the morning, we'll use these more and more. So let's talk just a little bit about the structure of this standard and most standards. So we have the standard itself, and then we have annexes. And those annexes may be guidance, which are informative, or they may be reference tools. So the standards themselves are usually quite brief, and we'll have a look at some of the elements. The guidance then expands upon that a little bit. So how would you implement this thing, be it participation or management commitment? What's involved in that? Some more practical suggestions. And the amount of guidance seems to vary very much by standard. We've got a fair amount of guidance in there. So there's, we believe, quite a lot of good information. And so that the standard would be useful right out of the box, so to speak, the committee felt there should be some more stuff at the back. And this was Annex B. And at first, when we talked about it, it got bigger and bigger. And so we thought about actually stapling the Encyclopedia of Human Factors and Ergonomics on the back of the standard. After figuring out that that was impracticable, we had to come up with another idea. And so following the general notion that we can think of different levels of prevention approaches, there's a general idea called SOBANE. S stands for screening, B stands for observation, AN stands for analysis, and E stands for expert. So that kind of corresponds a little bit to what Jonathan was indicating, that as you find more and more difficult problems, that you move up that chain. The decision was to have the Annex B to be mainly at the observation screening level and to leave the analysis tools to ergonomists and people who are trained occupational health and safety professionals. So this is the general standard, the general view that you'll get. So the way it's set up is that, first of all, you have the standard, which is pretty tight. It's got a bunch of headings, and you'll find those headings are reproduced on your yellow sheet. Hint. So here's the standard. There follows Annex A, and this is informative, and this is non-regulatory, so if you want to satisfy the standard, you have to satisfy the elements in the standard, say that you're following it. The guidance, again, is to help you do it, but it's for information only. So, statement of the standard, statement of some ideas about how you might do that. And in some sections, that's very extensive. In others, it's really quite short. The reference tools, which are a fair bunch of things, again, are informative. And we took the position that this was a workplace ergonomics standard, not an MSD prevention standard. But given the importance of MSD prevention within this general area, we had more emphasis on that area than others. But we didn't want people to forget that ergonomics includes organizational factors, cognitive, perceptual factors, and so the screening documents within there have check sheets and worksheets for those purposes. So after that very brief introduction, the main features of Z1004 are that it follows a common management approach. So the words are the same. So we might call it something else in another approach you might use. But all of the words within Z1004 and Z1000 use the same definitions. And so that's the point that came up earlier, is definitions. Not MSD focused, but very applicable. Design focused. So we do try and emphasize the importance of design, and we don't mean just design of a new hospital. We're also talking about little design. We need to change this section or this workspace. The same thinking should go into it each time. And participation is strongly included within the standard. So we have our standard PDCA approach, and the planning is the application of ergonomics. That's what we call it. So that's the actually going and working where the rubber hits the road. Evaluate and continual improvement. And you've seen we've put a number of little phrases in each box to give you a sense about what's included. And again, you'll see those little words in the boxes will appear on the yellow sheets. And again, I remind you that this presentation is available online, as is Z1004, so you can follow along and use that as a reference while you're doing this. So I see at least one laptop on each table, so we can move ahead in our table groups later on. I've also, for your convenience, indicated the section and the page where it occurs, so that's something that you may wish to jot down on your yellow sheet, if it's information, or keep track of that so you can find stuff in the standards. The other piece about Z1004 is, again, I mentioned the design focus. And to make it clear that we're talking about many stages of design, we wanted to identify the life cycle stages: plan and anticipate, detailed design, installation and training, operation and maintenance, and decommissioning and disposal. And that's a fairly standard life cycle set of activities. And the reason we wanted to do that is because when you mention ergonomics and design, sometimes people say, well, if you're trying to design it, you don't have any people I can see. How can I do ergonomics if I can't see anybody, if I don't know what they're going to do? And so we try to address that, and I'll mention that a little bit later on. And so the application of ergonomics changes a little bit in those different boxes. You can use different techniques and different kinds of approaches depending on where you are in that life cycle. And we try and give people some clues as to that. Okay, application of ergonomics, which is what it was termed in the standards. And as I say, this is the kind of meat and potato as well. We hope it's the meat and the potatoes of the process. So here we have identification, elimination of hazards, hazard elimination and risk control, monitoring, follow-up, protective measures. And we also emphasize the design piece. You've probably seen these kinds of diagrams many times. They're a pretty standard problem-solving loop. You have to identify hazards, where you assess risks and prioritize control or eliminate the hazards, implement preventative and protective measures, and monitor and follow up. And those are fairly standard. And when we briefly review Z1002, we'll see that they appear there too. I've said this a number of times here. So we can think about application of ergonomics at many, many elements, stages of design. And in all of these stages, the little words say application of ergonomics, so we can think about application of ergonomics / human factors. But also, it's a loopy thing. So we're talking about iterative changes. So we just don't say, well, people should do this. Sometimes you got to try it on a prototype and go back and redesign. So again, our problem-solving loop. This is pretty high-level stuff, so we're going to get down a bit more into the nitty-gritty soon. So the structure revisited, the reference tools. So this was the situation where we thought we were going to put an ergonomics or human factors textbook tacked on the back of the standard. So we went from a short standard, which is, I think, 20 pages. We added guidance, which took it to, what, 60 pages, I think? And then we added the Annex B, which is some of the tools, which took it to 100 and whatever. So we decided not to put the textbook in the back, but we wanted to, again, remind people that this was a workplace ergonomics standard. And so we wanted to be sure that people were aware that there were challenges both to system performance and human health at many, many different domains. So if you can't see something, perhaps there's a lot of problems for errors. And so the way we set it up was, in general, we identified factors, design factors. We then made a column, why should we worry? Why be concerned? What are the consequences? Because it seems to me that's often an issue is, well, why should I worry about perception or cognitive issues or organizational issues? Why should I worry about piecework? Someone who is not from this group and takes this up, they may not realize some of the negative consequences for both people and for system performance. And so we thought it important to make the consequences clear. And then we had some very brief recommendations. And the committee went backwards and forwards on how broad or detailed these recommendations should be. In the end, it's quite qualitative. And one of the reasons being, if you say a handle should be 1.5 inches in diameter, someone's going to take that and use it in a completely inappropriate way. And so in general, the guidelines, except for some specific lifting and anthropometric issues, is non-numerical. So another example here of repetition. We see the same pieces and identify that this appears in multiple places. I mentioned that we also included cognitive issues, and why would we worry and what could we do about it. So whether we're designing a new hospital or a modification of an existing workstation, we should think about many, many levels of human functioning. It so happens that there's a very large number of pieces in our guidance related to musculoskeletal disorders. And so that's why we can think about Z1004, although it's ergonomics, and I'm going to use a big ergonomics, big E ergonomics, in its International Ergonomics Association terminology, where we think of physical, we think of cognitive, and we think of work organizational domains. So the standard itself is big E ergonomics for workplace. But we recognized that prevention of musculoskeletal disorders was a challenge in workplaces. And so we made sure that there was enough meat in the guidance and in the annex to let people move ahead on MSD prevention. So because of the fact that we were doing double duty there, the standard, the way it's written, has a hope of being useful for MSD prevention. Because if you look at the Encyclopedia of Human Factors, or a Handbook of Human Factors, there's not very much related to MSD prevention. Huge number of other issues. And so we wanted to put the value for the community in terms of prevention of MSDs, given that is a current issue and problem. Again, to emphasize, common management approach, both across hazards and risks and across different parts of the system, environment and quality. I just made the point that it's not MSD focused, but there's a lot of information there. Design focus and participation is emphasized in many places. Okay, let's very briefly now have a look at the broader area of standards and see what we might be able to use or relate to. We already heard Ron mention that Z1002, the Hazard Identification, Elimination, and Risk Assessment and Control, may be useful to us. The Z412 may be useful to us. And so let's have a very quick look at those to see what's in them. Now, you might notice that I'm not spending a lot of time on the details in the standard. And the reason is, I think it's almost impossible for me to talk about every line and every detail and every clause in the standard. It just doesn't work. And so that's why we're having you use the standard and your knowledge of the other prevention activities to create this yellow sheet for yourself and within your table, and we'll pull it all together for the group. If you like, I can pull up the standard and read it line by line. No? No? Okay. Yeah, I'm convinced that you really don't want me to do that. So, highly relevant. Z412, Office Ergonomics. It's currently being looked at, and Ron mentioned that we've just met, and Lucy Hart is our leader. Thank you, Lucy. Because we're talking about process, I wanted to just make note of what the process was within that document. Because if the process is different, it makes it hard to relate them together. And I'm having a hard time reading those. I don't know if you can read them. No? I can't read them at all. Oh, hang on. Oh, the top one says, identify office design outcomes, consider the effect of a system, and seek organizational involvement. The third one says, identify workers' characteristics and seek their participation. The fourth one, with the little clock thing, says, understand job demands, job design, and work organization. The next one, which I don't know what that looks like, piece of paper maybe, oh, it's a plan, it's a blueprint. Plan or consider the office layout and design of workrooms. So workrooms there, not workstations. The next one down, number 6, says plan or consider the office environment. 7 is design individual workstations. So here we have more of a broad system approach before we get down to the details. Number 8 is review the design. And number 9 there is provide education and training. And there is the notion that this is a circular or an iterative process. So that's been out for a while, and it's recently been reaffirmed, but its process is quite different. Lots of good details in it, though. And some of the details include a whole bunch of these little check sheets and clipboards. How many people in the room are familiar with 412? Okay, fair number. I was very happy to note that Z412 is actually available view-only on the CSA website. So you don't have to necessarily buy that one. I don't know why it is, but I found it on there the other day. Okay, that's what I just heard from Jonathan, is there wasn't an arrangement made recently that any standards that are referenced in health and safety legislation are provided view only on the CSA website. I didn't believe Z412 was mentioned in the Ontario regulations, but Jonathan has just indicated they are in the Nova Scotia.
No, I just say it might be done.
Okay, sorry. So if anybody knows whether Z412 is mentioned in any OSH legislation, that would be good. Perhaps it's not available anymore. Perhaps it was a slip-up. But I found it.
The other point is that originally it wasn't a standard. It's not a standard. It's a guideline.
Yes.
Right? So the whole structure of it is very different from the standard. It's working together. It's a lot more informative in terms of providing the tools.
Yeah.
A lot of this was just right in the original standards. All the guidance material wasn't there, or this was really a guidance document.
Yeah, Jonathan's reminding us that Z412 was in fact not a standard. It was called a guideline standard for a while. And so I guess the way you could think of that is that it's a standard without the standard. It's just the guidance and the annex. So if you took it like that, then that makes a little more sense. And so the general structure here, and this is a slightly different way of showing the relationship between the different elements of the Z1000, is we are going to spend a little time then on Z1004. We're going to talk briefly about the risk assessment piece. I've also got psychological health there. And there's a couple of reasons for that. That's very, very recent. Has anybody seen that or used the Z103? Very recent, and apparently a huge take-up in terms of downloads and purchases. And so companies are taking up, again, this within a standard format. And I think the question that Ron brought up is, do we want to have a separate approach for every hazard? And the philosophy that I see in Z1000 is that, no, we want to have a standard process and plug in different pieces depending on the nature of those hazards. And so I think this shows that organization quite well. But you'll notice that I've got that black thing, the Office Ergonomics, in a number of different places. So it's up by itself there in the top. That's right-hand corner. It's kind of under Z1000 or it's below Z1004. And where it's put will dictate what it looks like. And so if you have any ideas on that, I'm sure Lucy will be very happy to receive that. So we've just had the very first meeting of that standard. We already heard mention of Z1002. We didn't get permission to see that one. And I just wanted to show this briefly, and you'll see that it's an expanded version of our problem-solving loop. And so that's the beginning of it, and I think you can see the same general ideas. So there's lots of good stuff in there that expands the ideas about general risk assessment. Unfortunately, Z1002 and Z1004 were written simultaneously and didn't get harmonized, which is a pity, but that's one of the problems in harmonization that Ron mentioned. So we could raid parts of this. And Z1002 briefly recognizes that hazards for musculoskeletal disorders do exist, and there is some small amount of information there. Just give you a moment just to get a sense about what's in that. Okay, that's fairly high level. I think is what I want you to take away is the kind of level of detail we've got. Because the level of detail, I think, is something that's going to come up later on. So the standard is very concise. The guidance expands it a bit, and then the informative annex makes it bigger, but it still only scratches the surface. Just thought I'd introduce the ACGIH TLVs and BELs. And the reason I'm doing that is I often hear that, this ergonomic stuff is so soft. We need numbers. We need good numbers. ACGIH is reasonably well accepted. And you, I'm sure, are familiar with the fact that we do have a number of elements in those ACGIH standards. We have one for hand activity level, which is an upper limb tool, which is a couple of pages, quite usable, and has been shown to be related to carpal tunnel syndrome prospectively, where the values that you get out of that. And so if you hear from someone, perhaps, are there any hygienists in the room? Oh, okay. That the TLVs and action limits coming out of here are on par, and perhaps better, than some of the other TLVs for some other agents. And so we do have some TLVs and action limits for upper limb activity and for lifting. So we can get some hard numbers. So you're probably aware that ACGIH, American Congress of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, pleads not to use their standards as regulations, their TLVs are regulation. My recollection is we have done that in Ontario for some chemicals. So they're probably as close to standards as we might get. So just to remind us that there are standard-like things around. So, my goodness, we got process stuff and we've got tools. And I think many of you are familiar with most of these. So here we have the MSD prevention series at the top right, top left. Yeah. I can't tell my left from my right. You can imagine what it was like when I was teaching my daughter to drive. Fortunately, she doesn't listen to me anyway, and so we actually ended up quite safely at the destination. So I had to stand like this, so I knew which way, this is left by the way, which way to say, take the left lane. Anyway, so if I'm confused, you know why. We also have the CSA standards there. There's also a fair number of documents and recommendations around participative ergonomics. Institute for Work and Health, Unite, and some of the automotive partnerships, to name just a few. And then and then at the bottom, underneath the CSA, we have ISO and OHSAS, Occupational Health and Safety Assessment Series System, 18,000. And then in the rest of it, we've got a bunch of tools. So one of our decisions is, how do we select an approach and some tools that will serve us well as we move forwards? The tools is not quite so critical today. We could spend a complete other workshop, which we might. But again, it's more high level. So, circling back, just as we should do, to continually improve our understanding. In our occupational health and safety management system, we have a number of themes. And so these are the themes that you will find on your yellow sheet. And these have been named to match those in Z1004, Z1000. They may not be in the same order, the wording may be a little different, but they correspond reasonably well. And so the idea is that, do we identify these elements as we move forwards? You can't read this, and I'm not going to let you, because that's what's in your green pages, your definitions. And so the main piece that I want to do to reveal where two major possible directions processes are, is to think about a comparison of what the guideline, the OSH code guideline, presents in its multiple volumes and what's in the CSA standard, and organize that in terms of the elements of the occupational health and safety management system. And we would expect that Z1004, because it's called an occupational health and safety management system, should have most of these elements. The question is how much of each element they have. And so coming back to your work now, based on the high-level overview I've given you, the availability of the standard through the internet, your intimate familiarity with the WSIB guidelines, I'd like to take a first kick at looking at these different elements. So I said that this was a workshop, and so the idea there would be that you would work. And so what I've done here is given you just a kind of a little example, and this is very detailed. And so we come back for each of these elements. Is it even mentioned? Is it in there? And if it's not mentioned, it's a 0. Minimally, a plus, plus plus for good, and plus 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 for comprehensive. And so this is an example that by the end of the day, we want to have some feeling for. And so what I've done is I've taken the section 2, section 2 of the WSIB OSH code guideline, and we found participation and MSD prevention process. And we've made a note under worker participation, but we found some sections. I didn't rate it. That's up to you to rate. We found it in this document there. And you can judge in your organization whether you had any.